Recently, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade and Casey, and as a result of this decision, it has refocused discussions around issues relating to abortion, and of course has intensified the pro-life, pro-choice debate taking place here in the U.S. And of course, at the very heart of this debate are issues relating to human value, human rights, and human personhood. The purpose of this conversation today is to explore some of these concepts from a Christian worldview perspective. And we're going to take an interdisciplinary approach today. And the hope is that this conversation that we have will help equip you to be better able to engage in meaningful and impactful conversations with those people you meet around the issues related to human value. I'm joined today in studio by Ken Samples, a theologian and a philosopher who is a senior research scholar at Reasons to Believe. I'm also joined by Mark Perez, who is the chief operating officer at Reasons to Believe and a member of the scholar community and a philosopher of science. I'm also joined via Zoom by Dr. Christina Cirucci, who is practices medicine. His specialty is OBGYN and is involved in the pro-life debate, the pro-life conversation. And I am a biochemist. My name is Rana. I'm the president and CEO at Reasons to Believe. And so we're just grateful again for your interest in this live stream. And thank you so much, Chris and Ken and Mark for joining us in this conversation. What I thought we would do just to get the ball rolling is to have each of you maybe take a minute or two and introduce yourself to the audience and maybe give us a sentence or two as to why you think this conversation is important to you. Ken, maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, well, I've worked at RTB for 25 years and am very happy to work on the scholar team. I think this issue is very important for a number of reasons, but I would say that, you know, if people are made in the image of God, which is a fundamental biblical teaching, then people uniquely have dignity and value. And I've always been interested in ethical, bioethical types of questions. And so this seems to me like a very critical issue for today.
Mark?
One of the concerns I have in the question is that people are often taken away so far by their emotions that they lose touch with the ability to reason properly. And so I like to see this as an opportunity to encourage people to reason through, even though these are emotional questions, they still have some rationality to them. There are some things that we can look at and actually weigh them and make comparisons and do things rationally. And so that's what I'm calling people to do, is to think clearly and think critically.
Christina, Chris.
Yes. Well, as an obstetrician, I have two patients, the mother and the baby. And the whole idea of personhood, which is now the discussion rather than is it a life, is it a person, that's very near and dear to my heart. I do a lot of work in pro-life work and just have a heart for the unborn, and I see them as little people.
Yeah. And, you know, I think from my perspective, you know, I would share your sentiment, Ken, is that, you know, from a Christian worldview perspective, we think every human being has inherent value. Every human being is sacred because they bear God's image. And so, you know, when it comes to issues about human value and human rights and in personhood, the Christian worldview has a lot to say about it. And these are complex questions where it's an interplay between science and philosophy and theology at minimum. And there's also even legal questions that come into play. So this is not a simple conversation to have. This is a complex, sometimes nuanced conversation. So I hope that what we have to offer today, again, is helpful to people. Let's get started with the idea of human value. And we've already touched on this, but maybe we can elaborate a little bit more. What is the basis for human value and human rights from a Christian perspective, and then also from a secular perspective? How would we, you know, compare and contrast the the concept of human value in these two very different worldview systems. Ken, maybe you could start off, and then we'll just invite others to jump in.
Yeah, I would touch on the Christian idea, and I think you go right back to creation. The doctrine of creation says that only God existed, and then God brought all other contingent realities into existence. So he owns everything. It all belongs to him. He's created us in his image. The dust of the ground, the breath of life, man became a living soul. So human beings are made by God. They're not the product of blind, mechanistic, natural processes. They are creatures of God, and they have dignity, they have value. Fuzz, I would even say that this issue has been going on a long time. I think one of the reasons Christianity grew so rapidly in the ancient world is that Christians treated children, Christians treated minorities very differently than the Romans, the Greeks, and even the Jews. So Christianity, invented hospice, invented orphanages and hospitals. I think all fundamentally because of that biblical teaching that people bear God's image.
Mark, Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
Chris, go ahead.
So I would certainly agree. It's all, from a Christian perspective, it's all based on being made in the image of God, where God's the crown jewel of his creation. And from a secular perspective, we see it, I think the secular world sees it differently. Is this person wanted? Is this person, does this person, are they productive? Can they perform functions? And I disagree with that view. Or they would say, is it inside the womb or outside the womb? So there are lots of different ways they may look at, but I think as a Christian, it's that people are made in God's image.
Chris, you bring up an interesting point, and I saw, Mark, that you're about to make a comment. So sorry for interrupting, but it's kind of like a utilitarian view that establishes value, right? And of course, then the
greatest good for the greatest number.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And so, there's not really necessarily a clear criterion for what really establishes human value, but it seems to me even people with a secular worldview see some value in human beings, right? And look to preserve human life, at least for some people, right?
I think one of the problems that the secular group has is that they don't have a justification for any foundation. In other words, whatever value they hold arbitrarily, because they don't have something like a Christian has, which is to appeal to a God who has ultimate value and imbues us with a value. If you're looking around trying to figure out, well, is somebody valuable after they're born? Are they valuable before they're born? Are they valuable in different ways? It's evidence that your foundation is arbitrary, that you don't have a standard to make these kinds of determinations. And I think it's here where the Christian worldview really supersedes the secular and shows its superiority, in that we can ground our beliefs in something completely independent of ourselves. Yeah. And we don't become arbitrary and end up with all sorts of strange beliefs that are contradictory.
Something that you said, Chris, that really is bone chilling to me is the child wanted, right? Mm-hmm. Is that person wanted? Maybe not just a child, but an aging adult who maybe is, suffering from significant medical issues, or may not even be, cognizant, suffer from dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that. Is that person wanted? That goes beyond kind of, is this person valuable to society? But even if that person isn't, if somebody wants them, then their life has value. But if people don't want them, then their life doesn't have value.
I think of Peter Singer, the bioethicist at Princeton University, who said not only did he accept abortion virtually up until birth, but that he said that parents ought to have 2 years to decide whether they want to euthanize their baby or not. I mean, that's a radical view. I'm very happy that secular people by and large value life. And I want to underscore that. But I completely agree with Mark. I think secularism has a hard time explaining things like value, meaning, and significance.
Chris, you looked like you wanted to say something. Did I interrupt you?
No, not at all. I just, when you said it's bone chilling to think of wantedness, it reminded me of hearing a handful of times abortion providers who are women who are pregnant and doing an abortion, and the idea that, well, my child's wanted, theirs is not. And that is quite disturbing.
Yeah.
And
Wow. Yeah. That is just an image in hypocrisy to some degree, isn't it? All right. One follow-up question. When we look at the Abrahamic religions, so this would be Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all three value human life. I've interacted with Jews, I've interacted with the Muslims who you recognize human beings are made in God's image in some concept within each of those religions. And so there is, again, a valuing of human life that goes far beyond what you would see in a secular mindset. But it seems to me that in Christianity, human value kind of reaches its pinnacle. And I think that's interesting. And I'm wondering if there's any thoughts as to why that might indeed be the case.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I know in Islam, they don't believe humans are made in the image of God because that would place them too close to Allah.
Right.
Certainly Judaism and Christianity, as the two principal biblical religions, affirm people's value because they're made in the image of God. I wonder, Fuzz, if Christianity doesn't come out further in a couple ways. And one way is that Christianity has reached the world. Judaism has typically been isolated in many respects, and sometimes isolated by persecution, but Christianity is almost a universal faith.
Yeah.
I also think another element that comes out is the incarnation. We believe as Christians that God has taken human nature and become man. So humanity must be a good thing if God were to take it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's your second point is exceptionally good, and that is because of the incarnation, there's just something about human value in a Christian worldview perspective that supersedes Judaism and even Islam.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's take on the question of personhood now, because, Chris, you alluded to this earlier. I can remember, I'm old enough now, that when it was the pro-life, pro-choice debate, the question was, is the fetus just a mass of tissue, or is it a human being, right? Where, pro-life advocates would say, well, this is a human being, and pro-choice people would say it's a mass of cells, right? It's, and of course, I think technology, particularly imaging technology, has really changed the conversation, where almost everybody now acknowledges that this is indeed a human being, but that the question is it a human person? Chris, would you care to elaborate a little bit on that point? And then
right. So we know it's at conception, this organism is a human being. It has this, he or she has their own set of unique chromosomes, unique DNA. But yes, then the conversation changes. Well, it's a human, it's not really a person. Of course, the big question is, when does it become a person? And, as a physician, there's no magic moment. So I consider scientifically and as a Christian that this is a person from conception as well as a human.
Well, it seems to me like the concept of personhood really does take on a very important role in a secular worldview, right? Because this is the way in which you communicate the idea that this human being has value, right? So the concept of personhood seems to be intertwined with value in a secular mindset. Either of you care to comment?
I'm going to let Mark talk about the philosophical side of personhood. I know from a Christian point of view, many Christian advocates for life would say that human beings have a personal nature. That is the qualities of being a person involves a nature that involves personhood. So it's not like the unborn are striving toward becoming a person. Rather, they are granted by their nature personhood. And that's going to develop. So they're persons in development, not developing toward persons. But Mark, lots of people talk about the definition of personhood philosophically. I wonder if you could characterize the debate that goes on there.
I couldn't really, because I don't know as much about those kinds of distinctions. I've seen them. It's one of the things that I've seen in philosophy that goes in all sorts of directions very unproductively. And the reason I think it's so unproductive is exactly what you just talked about. And that is, if you look at the biblical perspective, you start at an adult. You look at an adult and you say, all right, what is a person? We're not dogs, we're not sheep, we're not birds, we're not any of these other things. And when the Bible talks about what somebody was before they were born, it actually is a description of that. So it's, you knew me before I was born. You made me in my mother's womb.
Yeah.
And so what it describes there is personhood from the perspective of the persons that we know, the adults that we know, and then going backwards and carrying that back all the way to the moment of conception. And the only way you can do that, and the only way you can understand that, is not through philosophical discourse. It's through a recognition that there's a transcendent God who imbues that, who has the authority to grant that from the inception. I think if you're going to make any kind of philosophical statement at all, it is that you have to have a foundation that transcends any kind of human definitions. Secularism and the general philosophical question on personhood doesn't have that.
It's interesting to me that somebody like Peter Singer would say, that farm animals have an awareness, a self-awareness in his mind at a much earlier state than do human beings. Therefore, he would grant rights to farm animals that he would not grant to, let's say, a baby that's a year old. But there is a tendency then to try to measure personhood by, your capacity to be self-aware or your understanding of the nature of reality. But if that's the case, then there are lots of adults late in life that no longer have those capacities. I think this biblical idea, the Christian idea of us being given a personal nature by God, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Ken, you're making an interesting point, because in a sense, in a secular framework, you've got to define what you mean by person.
Yeah.
Right? It's not an inherent quality that human beings possess, but rather it's some kind of quality that emerges at some point. And then the question becomes, well, what is exactly a person? How do you define it? And it seems like it's largely arbitrary. Now, on the surface, self-awareness or sentience seems like a really nice scientific concept where you're grounding personhood in science, right? But then when you start to press into it, as a biochemist, I ask, okay, how do you define sentience? I've not seen a satisfactory definition. So I can't measure it if I can't define it. And then even if I could define it, I don't know how I would go about making that measurement, right? And when does sentience emerge, and when does it not? At 1 year old, a human infant, not a person because they lack an appropriate amount of sentience, but suddenly at 2 years old, there's some kind of event that means that, or some kind of gradual emergence where suddenly, they have sentience. And how do you know that? And it's maybe in some infants, it's not at 1, it's 1.5, or some it's at 2.5. So to me, you're sounding scientific, you're sounding rational and sophisticated with that concept, but when you start pressing into it, it's vacuous, I think. Chris, as a physician, how do you react to this idea of what is a person from a secular framework?
Right. Well, I agree with what you're all saying. I guess the only thing about Peter Singer is maybe he's more honest than everybody else, because, he doesn't draw a distinction between in the womb and outside of the womb. Whereas I think the secular world, the pro-abortion movement, mostly it's pre-birth or after birth. And like you said, there's nothing specific that happens. It's, yes, this child's dependent on his mother, but so is the 3-year-old. We have lots of people who are dependent that are people.
It's interesting about Peter Singer, and I agree with you, Chris. There's a candor in Singer. I think I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I think he's trying to live consistent with the secular worldview. On the other hand, when his mother reached an age where she suffered from dementia, he would not pull the plug, so to speak. And I think it's there where we begin to see that this issue, Fuzz, is not just about unborn human beings. It also relates more and more to people who are in the aged times of their life. So it's in the early and the late.
Chris, I've got a question for you. And it's this. I mean, it's all under the umbrella of when does a personhood begin in a secular framework? Because, you and I would both agree, and of course, I'm sure Ken and Mark would too, it's at the point of conception. To me, biologically, that's the point of discontinuity, right? Where there's now a new human being that's genetically distinct from every other human being that's ever lived. But there are other people who say, well, maybe, and I've heard Christians make this argument, who were trying to justify embryonic stem cell research. Well, it's not technically a person until implantation happens, right? Which then, allows for in vitro fertilization and embryonic stem cell research. Or it's not really a person until some critical stage in development that takes place. The Texas, a few months ago, in the state of Texas, what is it, with AB 8 or something like that, where it was the heartbeat bill, right? Where when you can detect a heartbeat, now it's a person, right? So what would you say as a physician who is intimately familiar with embryonic growth and development? What would you say to people that try to anchor, again, personhood, not so much in sentience, but maybe in key events in the developmental process?
For one thing, it's a slippery slope. It's the first thing I'm thinking. That's not really what you're asking, I know, but we start killing babies in the womb, and then we start killing Down syndrome, and then we start killing our elderly. And as Mark said, if they don't have any foundation for beliefs. But the other question you asked me, can you rephrase that again?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people, and I see this particularly among Christians, who would lean towards a pro-choice position, who would try to justify that position by, arguing that it's really a key developmental milestones that are more important than actually the point of fertilization. And so this is a way to kind of allow for embryonic stem cell research, for therapeutic cloning, if you will, by saying, yeah, we can create human embryos in the lab, but because they're created in the lab and they're never going to have a chance to implant, they really aren't persons. It's only at the point of implantation, or maybe, some key stage in the developmental process, where maybe the notochord develops, or there's some kind of primitive heartbeat or something like that.
Well, it's interesting when you talked about it's not at fertilization, it's at implantation, reminds me of how really in my field, kind of changed the definition of pregnancy to therefore make things, certain birth controls, not an abortifacient. Like they would say, well, it's not pregnant. Pregnancy doesn't happen at conception. It happens at implantation. Therefore, if this contraceptive method, of course, they don't delineate it this clearly, but you can kind of see how things go down this path. They change the definition of pregnancy. And so if something interferes with conception at that early stage, they would not even call it an abortifacient. So, yeah, I mean, it's all, where do you draw these lines and who are we to be drawing these lines? I mean, what's the difference intrinsically between an embryo in a test tube, in a petri dish, and one in the womb? Obviously, one has a better chance, but from a personhood standpoint, I don't see how you can make that difference. But I think they do definitely change. I have seen in my career that change of that narrative and those definitions is actually disturbing.
I mean, as a philosopher, Mark, what do you think when you start hearing people changing definitions, in order to justify a position?
Well, I see it as intellectual sleight of hand. Yeah, that they're just playing games with that. It's the same thing when you're talking about at what point are they sentient, and what endows sentience with a value that non-sentience doesn't have. And that's arbitrary. So when you look at something, for example, is a zygote a person, is an embryo a person, et cetera, one of the questions that should be posed is, what would it be if you didn't intervene? So that question isn't asked very often. So in the absence of intervention, this is going to be a person. So why isn't it a person at that point? And if the question is, at what point in there are we going to call it a person? Then you need to ask the question, what would it be if there were no intervention? If you didn't kill it, what would it be? Same thing you could ask if you wanted to apply a similar range of reasoning to somebody who just got hurt in the hospital. They're in the hospital, they're not sentient, they're unconscious. And the only way to get them to be out of consciousness and back into consciousness is to intervene. And so in that case, it's the inverse. If you don't intervene, then you end up with not a person, you end up with somebody dead. So the similarity in the two is that, or the analogy is that in one case, an intervention stops something from happening. In the other case, not intervening is what causes somebody to not be a person. And so you can look at those two extremes and really see that the whole idea of trying to cut the lifetime between zygote and birth into these different stages and then applying a value to those is a farce. It really is an intellectual farce. It really doesn't work.
Okay, Chris, anything you want to add before I move on to the next question?
No, I just appreciate how Mark explained that. It's true, making these false divisions that aren't really there. And so thank you, Mark.
Okay, so this is an ethical dilemma that I've seen, posted on the internet. So, take that for what it's worth. But it really relates to this whole idea of personhood and human value. And this is, a dilemma that someone who advocates for a pro-choice position has posed. And it's something like this. Suppose there's a building that's on fire, and there's a small child trapped in the building. And then also there's a refrigerator in the building that is filled full of human embryos. And you're able to go into the building, but you only have enough time to save one, either the child or the embryos that are stored in the refrigerator. So the question is, which one do you choose, right? And the person posting this dilemma was very proud of themselves, where they said something to the effect that, well, if you say that you would save the little child, that means obviously you see a distinction in value between a child and an embryo. And so therefore the child is, implicitly of more value than embryos. You really don't believe embryos are valuable human persons. Then of course, if you say, well, I would go after the tray of human embryos, and the comment is, well, I would never want you around my kids, right? And so, it's meant to be this no-win situation. So, help us to respond to this kind of ethical dilemma, right? What would you say? How would you respond to this ethical dilemma? And I think, Ken, you did an entire podcast dealing with this issue for your podcast, Straight Thinking, that people can check out. So,
Yeah, I have some comments, but
and then Chris, please feel free to jump in.
I want to hear Mark's comment about this. He's my favorite logician.
Well, the first problem is it's a faulty dilemma to start with. So, and in that respect, it's a red herring. It basically, and it's what I talked about early on, was that if you're going to discuss this, you should discuss it rationally and logically and reasonably. And this is a red herring in the sense that it just distracts you. It does not ask the question whether or when a zygote is a person. It doesn't ask that. It asks when or whether we can impugn a person who holds a particular position. And that's an ad hominem. That's an attack on a person. That's not an attack on the question at bar. So once you start to see these kinds of false dilemmas for what they are, you move aside. You say, all right, look, that one is silly. It's silly for another reason too. It's not even, if you were going to play that game, the kind of analogy you should actually be using is, what if there were 500 embryos in a burning building? Should anybody take any risk to go rescue them? That's the real thing. So that's more akin to what's inside of a woman's body. Should you take a risk to rescue them, or do anything to rescue them? That's actually the real question. That's the real analogy. So that's a faulty analogy on its face. It's a faulty analogy because it's not using the right kind of logic and analysis. And the other issue is that even if you take one side or the other, it doesn't mean that like if you choose the five-year-old, it doesn't mean that the embryos are worthless. It merely means you couldn't do anything to rescue them.
Right.
So it defeats the point of the person who's posing this kind of ridiculous argument or pseudo argument. It's really a false dilemma.
Well, I mean, in a sense, from a Christian worldview, every human being, because they bear God's image, has inherent worth and value. And so if you have a room full of people who are all image bearers and a single person who's an image bearer, it's not that the room full of people are more valuable, right? If you're weighing value, right? It's not an either or one's more than others. Everybody is of inherent worth and value. And so seems to me like you're in this situation that's a no-win, tragic situation, no matter how you act, and that you would grieve the outcome regardless. So to say that a tray full of embryos is more valuable than a single individual, even if you view that entire tray as image bearers, again, doesn't mean that tray is somehow superseding the value of that individual child, if that makes any sense.
I think of the difficult movie to watch, Sophie's Choice, where she's said by a Nazi officer, you can only keep one of your kids, the other one has to be gassed. Obviously, there's not a lack of value there. I think it's also begging the question, because I think the assumption is that the position that's adopted is that personhood is developing, rather than accepting the idea that no, they're already persons, but they're undergoing development. So I think there's an illicit assumption taking place there.
Chris, do you want to weigh in? Or maybe not, I don't know.
Yeah, this scenario, first of all, is very clever, but I agree, it kind of doesn't make logistical sense. If I'm going in to save, I'm going to save everybody I can. If I'm on a boat that's sinking and I have 100 people and I have a life raft that only can carry 3 people, I'm just going to do what I can as quick as I can. I mean, that doesn't mean the people we don't save aren't valuable. I think the bigger ethical question is, why are there 200 embryos in the refrigerator? But that's another story.
Yeah, good point. Okay, let's move on to the topic of ensoulment, because from a Christian worldview perspective, the idea that human beings have a soul, of course, is really central to the idea that human beings have value. And of course, when you start talking about the question of when, of human value, of personhood, we start talking about, the idea that, the human embryo is, again, an image bearer. Really, the question then becomes, when does that embryo acquire a soul? And so when theologians talk about ensoulment, Ken, what do they mean by that specifically?
Yeah, it's a very provocative question. I mean, what is our relationship between our soul and our body? I think of Genesis 2:7, the dust of the ground. From the dust of the ground, we're given the breath of life, we become a living being. So when theologians talk about where does the soul come from, when does that happen? You've got two basic views. One is called creationism, where God creates ex nihilo a soul and unifies that soul with the body of that living person. I think that's a very common perspective. There have been some very good Christian thinkers through the centuries who have advocated that. Fits well with Psalm 139, that God has placed us in our mother's womb. There's a second view that maybe is a bit of a minority position, but it's called traducianism. And it's simply the idea that just as God has given human beings the capacity to reproduce their body, maybe that same gift is given to the parents to give their children souls. So a soul would come forth from the parents. I think this is a provocative view. I think it is consistent with what we see in Scripture. It would explain, for example, maybe how does original sin, if you believe in original sin, how does original sin come forward? There is another view that I don't think is biblical, and it's the idea that God created a near infinite number of souls and he just grabs them and attaches them. That might be more like Mormonism or something other than that, maybe Platonism. But those are two views that Christians have held through the centuries.
Now, let me ask this question. We talk about the concept of the soul, right? Where the soul is an immaterial part of our being, right? That it seems to be integrated with our physical makeup. We also talk about the mind, at least in modern times, where the mind, at least, for those who, again, look at the human being as being both material and immaterial, the mind is the immaterial part of us, whereas the brain is the physical part, or we talk about the image of God. So how do these three concepts interrelate with each other, or do they interrelate?
Yeah, it's a challenging question. It's a challenging question philosophically and biblically. I think the Bible teaches a basic body-soul dualism. Again, breath of life, dust of the ground. On the other hand, there are people who would suggest a trichotomous position, mind, body, soul. I think that when you look at the scriptures and you try to reason through them, that things like our mind and our soul, our consciousness, that's the non-physical part of us. And all of that is kind of seen as the immaterial part. Then there's our body. And I have appreciated what Thomas Aquinas said, that there is such a unity between soul and body, Fuzz, that in the intermediate state, that would be after death, but before the resurrection, that in the intermediate state, if we're separated from our bodies, we're not fully human. Mm. So that unity, and I think it's very important not to think of a soul as if it's floating in your body. There's a real dynamic unity, and therefore trying to isolate the difference between the mind or consciousness or soulishness, boy, that's heavy lifting.
Right. So then in a creationist model, you could have a scenario where that individual at the point of conception is an image bearer, right? Because that we are image bearers because we are all in Adam, right? From a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
But you could argue that maybe ensoulment doesn't happen until some further point in the developmental process, that there might be a window where you have a human being without a soul. And then it's at some point in the embryonic process, God is stepping in to create the soul. Whereas in Traducianism, you would not see that separation. Is that a fair way to think about that?
Yes, but I would add that Christian thinkers, I think, largely have thought of personhood more as a part of our nature.
Right.
So it's not like we add a component at some point in the development. We have personhood because human beings are personal by nature. But it does raise the question, for example, if God creates rather than this process of Traducianism, how is then the soul affected by sin?
Mm.
How do we account for these kinds of things? And there's lots of debate and good people on all sides of the issue.
I think it's interesting also that the Bible doesn't answer that clearly. And that what it does answer is that our soul is accountable to God, that we are made in the image of God in some respects to do things that God would do as if he were here doing it. So we are actually thinking and loving and working and doing the things that God has done that only humans can do and that only God can do.
There's a theological concept that I've been reading about recently related to that, is that human beings are co-creators.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so when we try to figure out when this particular entity is able to interact with God, because that's ultimately what the soul is. It's an entity that will interact with God and be held accountable and be redeemed by God if given the chance. Then why does the Bible not talk about it all the way back to before the womb? The way I look at it is the reason that God didn't do that is because he presumes that there would not be intervention to stop it, unnatural intervention. So God can determine where he's going to cause somebody to no longer live and to have the soul move to heaven or to wherever. And the fact that he doesn't talk about that anywhere suggests to me that we need to be very careful about trying to put it anywhere or in any kind of combination. What we know is what the Bible is very clear about. We're accountable to God. We are like God in the sense that we are made in his image and whatever else that means. And that we don't know exactly where that starts, but we do know that he intends it not to be interrupted.
Chris, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, that's all great. That's all beyond me.
Yeah. So I guess in a sense that the position that we would all adopt, then, regardless of whether you hold to a creationist position or Traducianism, is that that in a sense it's probably you're walking on very dangerous ground to try to separate the point of ensoulment from the point of fertilization, right? Or the point of conception, I'm sorry. And that, that there's really no way to know exactly when the soul is indeed created, right?
And I might even add, there are some Christian philosophers who don't accept body-soul dualism. They believe that the body is animated. And so they hold almost a naturalist perspective. I think that's a real minority viewpoint, but it is out there. But to your other point, Fuzz, and I think it's an awfully important one, and it's one that Mark has mentioned as well, and that is there are profound things relating to the very earliest part of who we are as human beings. And for us to get in the way of that, or to act as if we can arbitrarily decide when this begins and when this doesn't begin, I think the Bible calls on us to be much more humble. Mm-hmm. I think science has indicated life begins at conception. I think advancements in putting a window on the womb, so to speak, that has allowed people to say, wow, what wonder it is that this unborn child has. But I agree with Mark. I think you have to be very careful and very humble about these issues.
Let me build off of a point you just made and throw the ball to Chris. This idea that science has put a window on the developmental process. I mean, when you think about what we know about human development, it's mind-boggling that the scientific capacity to monitor and to characterize the process of embryonic growth and development is absolutely astounding. And so, Chris, maybe if you could just comment a little bit about what we know and how, as a Christian who practices OBGYN medicine, how you think about our understanding of the developmental process.
Yes. So the first thing I think of is, we see first of all, an ultrasound, we see so much more than we saw on ultrasound 50 years ago. Our technology is so much better. And the first thing I think of is at 6 weeks, we can see a beating heart. Now, 6 weeks, the way we count 6 weeks, that's 6 weeks from the woman's last period. So that's actually only 4 weeks after conception. That in itself is mind-boggling. And I've seen it hundreds of times. And then you see on ultrasound later in development, and sonographers, people that do the ultrasounds, the detail they can see, and the 4 chambers of the heart, and tiny little something that's abnormal, that it's mind-boggling, and it all points to God's creation and the beauty of human development.
Yeah, and it seems to me that science really has been an incredible friend to the pro-life position, right? In really highlighting just how remarkable that developmental process is, and how much the developing fetus looks like a human being, even at the very earliest stages of development. Okay, let's shift gears and get into some even more controversial stuff. Is it possible for a Christian to hold a pro-choice position? So kind of a loaded question. So I'm curious to see who answers the question, number one, but two, kind of how you guys engage that idea. And also maybe we could just throw in this question too: does the Christian worldview allow for abortions?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. It's controversial, is what I mean. Obviously, there are people who are Christian who claim to be pro-choice. I guess the question I have in my mind is holding a pro-choice position consistent with the Christian worldview? Is it one that I think you can rigorously defend? Again, many Christian philosophers would again say personhood is part of our nature. So, we've talked about 4 weeks and there's a heartbeat, but the Christian philosophy would be that they already have personhood because that's a given of their nature. Now they're developing, and the body is developing, and the brain is developing, and the person is undergoing change, but they're already a person. They're already human. And I agree with you. I think science and technology has removed the question of whether it's human. It's clearly a human being. And thus the debate about personhood is already a concession that it's an unborn human. I find it difficult to accept the idea of a Christian pro-choice position, but I know there are Christians who hold that view.
What is it that they are holding? I mean, if they're holding a pro-choice view, are they merely holding the political view that people should have the choice, or are they endorsing abortion?
I think it may be both. I think if I can put myself in their mindset, I think there are some people who would say, I'm uncertain as to when it really is a conscious person. So they're not adopting a philosophical view that I would adopt. I also think they may be saying, look, if I might differ with you. I mean, a Christian may say, look, I hold a pro-life view, but since you're not a Christian, I'm going to acknowledge that maybe you could hold, for political reasons, a pro-choice position.
Yeah, I've heard people argue along those lines that, look, I'm personally pro-life, but the question of abortion is really a legal question. And so therefore, do I really have a right, as a Christian, to impose my particular viewpoint that's driven by my theological position, to impose that, on a secular culture at large, right? That really becomes a legal question. If this is what the law allows, then I support people's right to make that decision. That's one argument I've heard.
Yeah, I think I understand that. I think the broader point is what I hear a little bit from Ken, is that some Christians do not appreciate the nuances of the Christian viewpoint about how life needs to be protected. So they don't understand many of the things that we were discussing here. So in that regard, at least you can understand a Christian, a real Christian, holding a pro-choice position in that legalistic way. Now, if I were to hear somebody give me that legal argument, though, I would say, well, we have a prohibition against murder. That's an ethical question. Why would we protect people from murder if we wouldn't protect a baby from murder, if the unborn child is indeed a human being, somebody that God wants us to protect? So the argument that it's just a political question, I would counter that way and say, so is murder.
Yeah. Chris, have you encountered people who would hold to a Christian perspective that are pro-choice, and what is their justification? How would you engage that?
What I have heard people say, one argument would be, like you said, well, I'm pro-life. I would never kill my baby, but I can't tell other people what to do, as though that's more compassionate. But if you carry that argument, then would I say, well, I'm not going to murder somebody, but I can't tell you not to? I mean, our society has a right to protect its people. So it all goes back to personhood. And I don't find that to be a compassionate, tolerant, compassionate view. I think the other argument people use is, well, but that child's going to suffer. That child has this disability, or the mother's poor. She already has 10 kids and she can't feed them. And that's not right to bring that child into the world. And well, we may need to do more to help those situations. I don't see how that justifies, again, killing a person. But those are the two arguments I think that I hear. I don't find the true Christian worldview. I don't see how abortion can be compatible with that.
Now, I've seen also some people argue along the lines of women's rights, where it's like, look, that a woman has the right to do with what she wants with her body, that God has given us freedom. And if being pregnant kind of inhibits that freedom, is that, reason or justification, for a pro-choice position from within the context of a Christian worldview. So in other words, we've been emphasizing, of course, the dignity and the value of the child, right? And the emphasis is on the child. But what about the woman's right to do what she would do with her body, right? So how would we engage that point? Because this is clearly very much part of the pro-life, pro-choice debate in general, but then even from within the context of a Christian worldview, how does that idea that a woman has rights to do what she would want to do with her body, how does that impact the conversation?
Well, I would say there is a second life. There's also a second body in the pregnancy, and it's the child. So it's the fetus, the unborn human is not part of the woman's body. It has its own body. So I think part of it is trying to focus on it correctly. I would say also that to have a right is never a right to do what's wrong. I think to have a right is from a biblical point of view, a Christian point of view, something that should lead to an ethical outcome. Now, having said all of that, and given the sensitivity of these issues of our time about gender, about sexuality, I think that Christians who are pro-life should seek to do all they can to help people who are in positions where Chris has suggested. Maybe they feel, I don't have the financial basis to bring a child into the world, or I'm concerned about, what if the child has health problems? I think Christians can tackle the abortion issue on many fronts. And I think one of them is to suggest that we care about young women, and most abortions are young women, that we care about them and we care about their circumstances.
Chris, any thoughts?
So I go back to the basic medical ethics we're all taught as physicians, and there's 4 principles. So one is beneficence, meaning do good, do the right thing. One is malfeasance, do no harm. One is autonomy, which is the patient has autonomy and can make their own decision. And one is justice, which is equality, treating people fairly. So looking at autonomy, if a woman has cancer and I say, well, I can cure your cancer with this treatment, or you need this treatment, she can say no. That's her right. I can't force her to have a treatment. That's her right. If, on the other hand, if she says, well, doctor, cut off my leg, well, I'm not going to honor that autonomy for her to tell me to do that, because that would violate beneficence, doing the right thing. So with autonomy, a woman, the problem is not the problem, but there's 2 patients, and the woman's autonomy, and I think it's been said, is superseded by the baby's autonomy, who can't speak for him or herself. And so there, you have to look at all of that.
Mark, any thoughts?
No, I think the 2 that have already spoken captured exactly what I'd say.
All right. Well, we're about to bring the discussion to a close, and I just wanted us to look at these final 2 questions here, and that really is ultimately, why are Christian, or at least so many Christians, pro-life? What really is the motivation? Because a lot of times, I hear comments to the effect that, it's the Christian Taliban, that you're just trying to suppress women's rights, that you're bringing this arcane sexual ethic, to the table, and it's this, really ancient, perverted sense of the patriarchy that really is, motivating Christians, that there is almost a hatred of women, and you're trying to suppress women's rights and that type of thing. That's the real motivation for why, Christians are pro-life. They just, want women in some kind of servitude. So, so in light of that, why are so many Christians pro-life? What's the ultimate motivation? How would you respond to that?
One of the chapters in my latest book, Christianity Cross-Examined, I look at the question of, why did Christianity grow so rapidly? I think clearly, Fuzz, one of the reasons is that the early Christians, they cared about people who had no power. Houston Smith said, unlike the gods on Mount Olympus, Yahweh cares about the widows, the orphans, the immigrants. I think Christian moral principles tell us that we live in a fallen world. We live in a world where people need to be protected. They need to be cared for. I mean, Greeks and Romans could drop their kids off and let them roll down the mountain. Somebody wanted to adopt them, fine, but they didn't have to. But it's Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount that talks about children, talks about their dignity, their value. He also talks about the harshness of God to people who would harm them. I might add one other point, Fuzz, and it's this. Sometimes an area in which Christians do disagree as to how far the pro-life position should extend. Some Christians would say, for example, we shouldn't execute people who've committed capital crimes because their life values. Other Christians would come along and say, no, in that context, they have sacrificed their own perspective. But there is some division among Christians about how to apply a pro-life viewpoint.
Chris.
Well, I would hope most that Christians are pro-life because their worldview is based on the Bible. But practically, when I look at Christians, and yes, we are accused of, oh, you hate women, you just, Handmaid's Tale, etc. But really, I see that women or any pro-life person, I see that they love people, they love children. Pregnancy resource centers are criticized up and down, and yet these people are out there helping women, serving women, sacrificing. So there's always going to be bad apples and people with wrong motives in any group, but I do not see that in pro-life people. I see a love for God and a love for God's creation, love for people.
Mark.
Christianity seeks justice, and that means to make sure that everyone has the same ability to have what they're supposed to have according to God. And one of those is life. And when God allows a life to be started, he doesn't allow anybody to take the life without going through some very particular things like a murder trial. But short of that, there is no moral action being taken by an unborn child. So there is no right to take that child's life. So as a Christian, the Christian worldview takes the position of we want to protect everyone, including the babies that some women may not want to carry. So it's hard to separate those two, and a pro-life position is natural. I'd say it's intrinsic to the Christian faith.
Right. And then last, but definitely not least, what would you say to someone who's been involved with an abortion? Chris, what would you say?
Losing a baby, losing a pregnancy, whether by miscarriage or abortion, there's a lot of different feelings with those two, but women feel a lot of shame and guilt and grief. And the pro-abortion side would want to say, oh, you shout your abortion, just move on. And my experience with women in the office is that this is almost never the case. And there's a lot of difficulty and a lot of pain. And I would say to them that there is, in God, there is forgiveness and there is hope and there's healing. I would encourage people to share your story with someone you trust, to see a counselor. There are a lot of resources for women who have had abortions, but I don't think, from what I see, women don't just have this done and then walk away unchanged. It's a very difficult thing. And I think, as Christians, we want to be there for them.
Ken.
I'm not sure I could say it any better than the way Chris said it. I remember, my wife and I, we had our two daughters. There were no problems with the pregnancy. There was a third pregnancy, and my wife had a miscarriage. And I'll tell you, it was like somebody hit me, in the chest. It hurt. And I can only imagine the things that Chris has described, guilt, but there's something greater than our sinfulness, and it's God's grace. It's God's forgiveness. And I would want to extend that to people, that God can forgive all of our sins.
I'm presuming that if the discussion came up, that the woman would have something to say. And so the most important thing for me would be to listen to what she has to say. Is she grieving? Is she angry? What is her position at that particular moment? And then be as charitable from a Christian perspective as Jesus would be in the same situation. And talking about the grace of God, forgiveness and redemption. And what else can we do for you?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead and bring this live stream to a close. Thank you so much, Ken and Mark, and of course, Chris, for your incredibly insightful comments on these really challenging questions. And, if there's, again, anything that I could encourage those people who are watching with, it's this, is that these are very hard, difficult, challenging conversations to have. There's a lot of emotion associated with these types of conversations. People feel incredibly strongly about these issues. And it's my prayer that this conversation has helped you to feel more confident and better equipped to engage in these conversations. But above all, I would really like to emphasize the fact that the most important thing we can do is to engage in a loving, respectful manner with compassion and with gentleness and respect. Because if we are unable to do that, as strongly as we might feel about our pro-life position, we're just going to be a gong that's banging around that nobody's going to really want to listen to, that's going to be annoying. And so my prayer is that, again, that you don't shy away from these conversations, but that you, again, do them in the way that Peter urged the church in Asia Minor to respond to the question about how is it that you have hope, and that you do it with gentleness and respect and a clear conscience. So until next time, remember that the more we discover about science, the more we have reasons to believe. God bless you.